blackmail the states and bully them into doing what they want. Okay, that's what we call extortion in the normal world, but it's legal extortion for them. When it comes to the people, well, we just stopped teaching the Constitution. And so the people don't know it, they don't understand it. If you don't know something, you can't really defend it. We're witnessing the defects within the system now. It's not to say that the Constitution needs to be rewritten. It is to say that there are several things that have gotten out of whack when it comes to the separation of powers and checks and balances, and that's why the Founding Fathers thought it was essential to have Article 5 bypassed around Congress to do constitutional amendments. They didn't trust Congress either. Okay, they understood that governments, as they expand in power, they're going to abuse that power. And we've been witnessing the abuses get worse and worse. We just had a governor of New Mexico unilaterally declare that she was suspending the Second Amendment for 30 days. She has no authority, no jurisdiction to do this, but consequences be damned. Now, thankfully, the courts did step in and already threw it out, but the fact is that she tried. Now, if you think back like 10 years ago, that would have been unheard of. And then the pandemic came. And the pandemic changed a lot. The government, the federal government, saw how much they could get away with. The state governors saw how much they could get away with. Instead of ruling through legislative bodies who are supposed to represent us, they did it through decree. They determined when we can leave our homes, when, where, and how we practice our faith, what we must wear when we leave our homes, what businesses are essential, what businesses aren't essential. People that never held a real job in their life were determining what businesses are essential. Think about that. Okay, even worse, they shut down schools in some cases for up to 2 years, destroying and damaging an entire generation that we're now seeing the results of. Then you factor in how governors like Kate Brown of Oregon actually encouraged her residents to call the cops on each other if they saw more than 6 people in each other's homes. Think about that. Like, those are tactics you actually see in North Korea, in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Now you're seeing them here in the United States. So something's fundamentally broken, something has to happen, and that's where Article 5 Convention of States comes into play. We know Congress is not going to change their ways. We're watching it right now in front of us. Look at the budget debate that's going on. When Republicans do talk about cutting spending, it's not really cutting spending, it's just spending a little less money than Democrats. Our national debt is $33 trillion. We are spending $500 billion in interest alone on that debt. To put that in perspective, we spend $850 billion on defense. And we can't even track an F-35 in this country. Amazing. Okay, but when you look at that, people aren't looking at the interest, but the interest is slated to jump up to $800 billion by 2025. It's going to be over $1 trillion by 2027. So we need fiscal restraints, and Congress isn't going to put it on us. Why aren't they going to do it? Because by the time the House of Cards collapses when it comes to government spending, well, the average age of a senator is close to 70, and the average age of a House member is about 56, 57. Most of them are going to be out of office by then. When we look at someone, anyone know who's running for re-election in California who decided she's putting her hat back in the race? Good old Nancy Pelosi. Okay, spending over 40 years in Congress. Did she make the situation better? No. You look at numerous politicians. They literally have spent a half century. I was talking to my students the other day, and we were talking about qualifications and experience and accomplishments. You have someone like President Biden, 50 years in government service. So I had a simple question. Out of 50 years of government service, name me one significant accomplishment he's had. And they couldn't do it. Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi all did. Name me an accomplishment that they had, and they couldn't do it. Why? Because, what?
They do bomb people.
That they do. But when we're looking at it, that's the amazing part. People have equated length of service into experience and qualifications. Just because you spend 30 years in something or 40 years in something doesn't mean you're good at it. You still could be terrible at your job. And many of our congressmen and women are. So we need to do something to change the dynamic. See, the Founding Fathers, when they first set up and established the Constitution, Article 1, Sections 2 and 3 laid out terms of Congress. To be in the House of Representatives, 25 years old, citizen for 7 years, and a resident of the state you're running in. For a Senate, 30 years old, citizen for 9 years, and a resident of the state running. Back then, they had built-in term limits. It was called death. If you're lucky enough to get into the Senate at 30 years old in 1787, how many terms do you think you're going to serve? Okay, so if you want about 1, 2 terms for the average. Our founding fathers wanted a citizenship legislature, where the citizen legislature would be ordinary people from ordinary jobs that would go meet once a month, for a month, about every 2 years, in order to handle the people's business. And then they would go back to their regular lives. It wasn't paid positions. It was called public service for a reason. You are servants of the public. Well, now they think we're servants of theirs. And that's a big part of our problem. So an Article 5 Convention of States can solve the problem with term limits. And if you look at Poland, 80% of the American people, regardless of political party affiliation, support the idea of term limits. When it comes to fiscal restraint, we all know what's going on. We all know this is unsustainable long term. We all know that Medicare, Social Security, the entitlement programs that we have that are separate from Medicare and Social Security, they keep on increasing in cost. We're not taking in enough revenues. We keep on increasing our national debt. We keep on printing money. We have high inflation, partly because of that, and energy prices. So we know Washington's not going to rein in the government spending. We know the states, many of them, are reliant on government giving them money, the federal government. 25% of the state budget actually relies on federal funds. And so Congress, they don't have to push through amendments to curtail their own powers. Why would they do that? And they're not going to have states ratify something that's going to curtail their powers, so it's up to we the people. We have forgotten the concept of federalism, where we have 2 levels of government, neither of which are created by the other, and both operate independently of each other. Now, today we have new federalism, thanks to FDR who started it. Now we have 2 levels of government, one of which is wholly dependent on it. And in order to break free of that dependence, we need to bring in and rein in the fiscal insanity that's going on in Washington, D.C. When we look at federal power and federal overreach, just look at the regulatory bodies that exist. Our legislative body will pass laws. But then the bureaucrats come in, and they're the ones that are going to interpret these laws any which way they see fit. Consequences be damned. And it's what has led to growing power in the federal bureaucracy. If anyone has noticed, the federal bureaucracy is a little bit out of control right now, right? Targets political opposition, thinks that it could shut businesses down just for no reason. Oh, well, we don't like what you're doing, so we're going to target you. We'll just audit you. Good luck getting lawyers and having to spend money on that and then bankrupting businesses. We see so much red tape that it's almost impossible to start a business today. Home Depot, one of the co-founders of Home Depot stated that if he wanted to start Home Depot today, he couldn't do it because of all the regulations that exist. Now, I mean, they want to now regulate coal and wood-fired pizza ovens. That's where we draw the line, especially in Staten Island. Especially, we draw the line. Okay, that's the best pizza you can get. But think of every aspect of our lives is now being regulated. For every law that's passed, there are dozens to hundreds of regulations that are part of that law that not even Congress intended. And yet, Congress doesn't use their power of oversight to rein it in. Instead, they grow the federal apparatus even more. Don't forget, it was under Republicans that we saw the largest expansion of government in history with the Department of Homeland Security. And that really changed the dynamic. I used to be in emergency management and Homeland Security prior to teaching full-time. And so we really saw the dynamic change. We saw the federal apparatus get even more powerful, more abusive. Looking into every aspect of Americans' lives. Between the NSA and the metadata capture program called PRISM, you have the United States Postal Service. So they deliver mail. There are postal inspectors to check and investigate mail fraud, so they do have special agents. But how many people are aware of the ICOP program that was in place for several years, where postal inspectors were monitoring social media channels, flagging posts, and sending them to the Department of Homeland Security? Most aren't aware of it. How many are aware that last year, on 4 separate occasions, the federal courts came out and stated explicitly that the FBI broke the law by illegally accessing the NSA's repository for information on Americans? On 4 occasions. Most Americans are unaware of that. We're now aware of the major censorship apparatus that we see being built out, not only within government, but by help by academics, where over $5 million of your taxpayer money has gone to the University of Wisconsin to build out a censorship program, where they're going to strategically identify information and correct it in the public domain. You have Carol Crawford of the CDC that was forcing Twitter to censor tweets that she deemed contained, quote, unapproved opinions. I mean, think about that logically. A government bureaucrat saying that people have unapproved opinions. Since when the hell does government get to dictate what opinions are approved and which ones aren't? So we're in serious trouble now. And then a new poll came out today, an Annenberg survey, where 77% of Americans can only name one freedom in the First Amendment. Think about that logically. You have 33% of Americans that don't know we have 3 branches of government. Do you think they know we have an Article 5 Convention of States that we could call? And when I teach this to my students, Article 5, it opens their eyes. Now, it's funny because I did participate in Williamsburg, Virginia, in the Convention of State simulation, and it was one of the best experiences I ever had. Why? Because I'm constantly getting pushback from people who are not political scientists. Not that political scientists are all that smart, believe me, have no morons. But they say, well, what happens if we call a Convention of States and we see a runaway convention? And they rewrite the entire Constitution. I will tell you...
Communists.
What?
They'll make us all communists.
Well, the thing is, we're seeing our Constitution be rewritten.
Yeah.
We're seeing it be thrown away, disregarded, because the Constitution is the only roadblock towards authoritarianism. And now, if nobody knows the Constitution, if the entire generation of youth is not taught about the Constitution, they're not going to defend it, right? You can't defend what you don't know. And that's what's going on in the United States. So when we look at this, the idea of a runaway convention is an impossibility. It's not going to happen, and I can tell you why. First of all, when you petition to hold a convention of states, it's a limited convention of states. You have to state the reason. You need 34 out of the 50 states to approve a petition to start a convention. Do you think it's easy to get 34 out of 50 states to agree on anything? So now let's say we actually have the convention. We finally get it pushed through. Now when I was in Williamsburg, Virginia, and we were participating in the Convention of States simulation, I went down there making assumptions. Of course, when you make assumptions, you're making an ass of yourself like I did. And I'm thinking, all right, most of the participants there, they got to be Republican. They're mostly going to be conservative. We're easily going to be able to push amendments when it comes to things like term limits, fiscal restraint, reining in federal power. Boy, was I wrong. Okay? And it's really amazing. So here are a lot of people that are like-minded that while we all agreed that term limits should be in place, there was a lot of dispute about what the term limit should consist of. Should it be 6 terms in the House to total 12 years and 2 terms in the Senate to total 12 years? Should it be 18 years in Congress? Doesn't matter if it's the upper house or lower house. And there was a lot of dispute. And it was really hard to get any real agreements out of it. And it really started to open my eyes. Something as simple as term limits that everyone could agree on. Well, it's easy in theory, but when you start putting specifics to it, it gets a lot more difficult. Reining in judicial power. That also wasn't that easy. There was no right or wrong answer. There was universal agreement that we should hold to 9 Supreme Court justices. Everyone agreed on it. But how do we make sure that the Supreme Court of the United States makes rulings based on the original intent of the Constitution, based on the letters of the Founding Fathers, based on the original documents of the United States? Well, there was a lot of disagreement about it. Because if we force the Supreme Court into one area, well, it could have impacts on the other. When it came to federal lands, okay, we have federal lands now in New York State. It's not as big of an issue as it is compared to the Midwest. But there are some states where the federal government controls 80% of the land in those states, and there's no recourse. And they control all the resources on those lands that those states can't use in order to make their states better, improve their states, invite employers into their states, create jobs, and expand. So there's a lot of complicated issues. Fiscal restraint. I sat on the fiscal restraint committee. Again, this is something I thought, we'll come to an agreement quick. We'll have it done in like 2 hours, and then we'll just be able to hang out and enjoy Williamsburg, Virginia. Okay? Took us over a day to come up with something. Why? Because what type of restraint do we put in? And then we have to worry. You know, there are times where the government, you know, there's a lot of people that talk about balanced budget. I support balanced budgets. But there are times where the federal government's going to have to spend more money, right? If we're in the middle of a world war, which God only knows this president's stumbling us into, then we're going to have to spend more money than we're taking in. And so we have to make caveats. What if we're facing an economic depression? And then how do we prove that? Because you don't want Congress to just make excuses to spend more than we're taking in. Oh, it's an economic depression, so we need to, you know, because the Fed says so. And so we need to spend more money. And so we had to come up with certain tools and mechanisms where, you know, 3/4 of Congress could vote to suspend the balanced budget if there is some type of national emergency. Now, 3/4 of Congress getting them to vote on something is much more difficult than just getting a majority in the House and 60 votes in the Senate. So we did put in some things. I wanted to see something, it got shot down, but I think it was brilliant. It's like really. I wanted to tie congressional salaries to the actual budget, where if Congress spends more than they're taking in, their salaries get reduced by 10%. And every subsequent year, they get, so an average congressional salary is about $175,000. So after year one, it would drop down to $58,000. After year two, it would drop down another 10%. After year three. Do you think if Congress had stake in the game and it was their paychecks on the line, do you think they'd be a little bit more responsible with taxpayer dollars? Do you think you'd see billions upon billions of dollars? How many people know that we spent over $500 million on democracy programs in Venezuela over the last 5 years? How well is that working out? Is Venezuela more democratic today or more authoritarian today? And we just, the Biden administration just approved 450,000 work permits for Venezuelans that have crossed over on the border. So when you look at it, we're spending money on democracy programs down there. The Venezuelans are coming up here. It tells you something's broken. We also spent $400 million on building walls. Not here in the United States, of course, but building walls in Tunisia, building walls in Egypt, Jordan, Oman. Interesting. Walls work over there. They don't work over here. So something is broken. So when we call the Convention of States, anyone that thinks that the convention is going to be run away is foolish. They never participated in the Convention of States. They wouldn't know because they didn't participate. The reality is that we thought, every single person there thought they had good ideas, and they didn't realize that it would be difficult to get an agreement, just a simple majority to support those amendments, to send them out of committee to the floor, and then it would all go back to the states. And even if it did go back to the states, in order to get those amendments ratified to the Constitution, you would need 38 states to do that. 38 states. So it's difficult enough to get 34 states to agree on anything. It's really going to be difficult to get 38 state legislative bodies or ratifying conventions to approve these amendments. So does anyone think that we're going to see some type of radical proposal, a ban on the Second Amendment, and that 38 states would approve something like that? That is not going to happen, especially when you consider the makeup of the states. Okay, while President Biden may be in the White House, while the Democrats control the Senate, while we're in the once great state of New York that has been under Democrat totalitarianism for the last several years, when we look at it, they're not going to be the ones to dominate this Convention of States. Okay, Republicans actually have the majority of state legislative bodies. I think it's about 22, we control both houses in the states. Democrats control both houses in 17 states. The rest are mixed. You have Republicans controlling one house, Democrats controlling another. So even if a controversial amendment was proposed, it probably wouldn't get approved at the Convention of States, and even if it did, it would never survive the actual ratification process. There are a lot of myths, and there is a certain group of people that wouldn't want to see a Convention of States. And that includes Democrats and Republicans. Why? Because the Convention of States actually returns the power back to the people the way it was intended. The Convention of States limits the government's power. And that's why they don't want to see it. A Convention of States will limit the lobbyists and the influence that they have over the system, dark money within the system. It limits their power. And that's why they don't want to see a Convention of States. If you notice something that's been occurring, and I've noticed this throughout my career, every single issue, the knee-jerk reaction is to look to the federal government to solve the problem.
Yes.
That's every single issue. And Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, progressives are all guilty of that. Now, the progressives and Democrats, they like government solutions. But Republicans that preach and conservatives that preach for limited government, why are we looking for the government to solve our problems for us? We have responsibilities and obligations in our own communities without government involvement. And when it does require some government involvement, well, that's where we need to start with local government and then work our way. Unfortunately, both Republicans and Democrats have invited in the federal government. And as the power expands within the federal government, the people are the ones that suffer. It is our liberties that get curbed, where most Americans think it's government that allows us to exercise our liberties, that it's government that gives us liberty. No. A liberty is inherent because we're human beings. The founding fathers laid it out clearly. And unfortunately, most Americans don't know that anymore. We have a major problem. We have major problems in this country. But the biggest problem is that the federal government has gotten so massive that even they don't know how many federal agencies there are. And this is probably one of the most frightening aspects. You would think, in the age of Google, the age of the internet, I could just go on a search engine and type in how many federal entities exist. And I would get a number that pops out. Here's how, well, there's 15 cabinet level departments, at least they know that. But here's how many agencies, here's how many sub-agencies exist, here's how many regulatory commissions exist, here's how many government corporations exist. It should all be laid out very clearly. Do you know that Congress actually had to commission a study to determine how many federal entities we have? But here's the kicker. It tasked the Government Accountability Office, the National Archives, the Federal Register, and then OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, to conduct this study. They all came back with different numbers. Every single one of them came back with a different number.
Was anyone right?
No. Well, I shouldn't say that. We still don't know. We still don't know. There hasn't been any type of universal agreement on how many federal agencies exist. When this country was first founded, it was 3 cabinet-level departments. That's it. State to handle diplomacy and foreign affairs, Treasury to handle monetary policy, and war. That one's self-explanatory. Now, there's some that came about that we understand, like I would not want to travel without the Department of Transportation and the FAA controlling the skies. Right? I won't want to go on an airplane if every single state gets to make up their own rules as to whatever. That would be a disaster. So we understand that there has to be some government involvement, but it's supposed to be limited. And be wary of those that preach about limited government, and yet they constantly vote to expand government. We don't hold our politicians accountable, and that's why we're in this mess in the first place. The American people have withdrawn from the political process. Our voter turnout is actually absolutely horrendous, particularly at the local levels. And look at the results we're getting. People wonder why. Well, it's because we're not participating. We're not making demands of our government. We, the people, are sovereign. The states are supposed to be sovereign. And we need to have our voices heard. And the best mechanism to do that I see, to rein in the federal apparatus, is through a convention of states, because Congress is not going to do it themselves. We have seen it. It's clear that it doesn't matter if Democrats are in power, Republicans are in power, budgets have expanded, debt has expanded, wars have begun, even though there's not been an active declaration of war since World War II. We just transfer the taxpayers' money out, consequences be damned. So it's time for the American people to step up. And I'm going to take questions too.
Sure.
So I want to open it up to questions because we need to have a dialogue and thoughts, opinions, what's your questions and concerns, how could I answer them?
I'm just a little concerned about some of the statistics you're coming with. I taught history for 25
You
years.
should be very friendly.
I did, and I immediately got a constitution with an answer. I contacted my congressman, got a constitution with an answer. I just was student I ever taught American history to. So I'm kind of shocked because I have to say a lot of my students from every gamut of ability knew instinctively, and I do think, public broadcasting and cop shows, they know their constitutional amendments, they know some things, and they because of that, no matter how many high-level students I taught to how many low-level students I taught. So I'm kind of surprised. And I know the New York City public school teachers do have high standards, and they're mandated and required to teach civics senior year. So I'm kind of confused by that.
Well, here's the thing. So when I give my students constitutional exercise. It's another brilliant exercise I did. And I do it because I like shaming. I believe shaming, especially among students, works. You embarrass them. There's no safe spaces in my class. And what I do is I give them the Russian Constitution. And I just replace Russian Federation and Duma with everything. Now these are college students. So Russian Federation is now United States. Duma is now Congress. I want you to read it. I want you to write 2 paragraphs on what you think of this document, this Constitution. And we're going to discuss it in class. Now, I teach over 235 students this semester. There's a handful of students that will email me and say this isn't the Constitution. And that should be the assignment. One sentence, this is not the United States Constitution. Instead, what do I get? I get these long, detailed responses about the foresight of the Founding Fathers and how brilliant the Founding Fathers were to talk about pension systems and health care. Because the Russian Constitution was developed in 1991 or 1992 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's a modern-day constitution. And they'll talk about how great this document is. I keep the stats. 90% of my students cannot distinguish the Russian Constitution from the American Constitution. And the Russian Constitution starts off with, we the multinational people, not we the people. Okay? That's on shockwave. So the question is, what are students actually learning? And one of the things that we look at is that civics, the half year of government that they get their senior year. Well, a half year of government, and I know that they get some government in 4th grade and in 7th and 8th grade, they get a little bit of government. But a half year is not enough.
They get a year and a half in high school, a year of American history and a semester of senior year. So I'm kind of confused.
Why not every year?
Right, well, they're learning global studies and everything.
By the time they get to my class, they should be able to almost recite the Constitution.
To
And they
be
can't.
American history, they don't teach civics.
And here's the problem with it.
I taught American history and I taught civics, so that's why I taught them.
Well, we do college surveys.
Yeah, I'm a New York City school teacher and I teach history and government. And I teach.
But here's the problem.
Constitution.
Here's the problem.
Put it into the hands of
Some teachers teach it.
That, yes,
The majority of teachers do not. In fact,
really out there.
they'll teach parts of the Constitution maybe and put in their own interpretation of it. But in our surveys, and I'm talking about at the collegiate level, the #1 response as to why they never read the Constitution after 13 years of an education, at least 13 years, it was never assigned to me.
Yes.
It was never assigned for me to read the full Constitution. It was never assigned. They never read the Declaration of Independence. Our education system has collapsed. Only 13% of students are proficient in American history. Only 22% are proficient in American civics. New York State performed twice below the national average when it comes to proficiency levels in education. What did the Board of Regents do? Instead of saying, oh my God, this is horrific, we need to fix this, they said, we're actually going to change the definition of what it means to be proficient to reflect the new normal. That was a direct quote from the New York State Board of Regents.
Yes, that's
We-
true.